The night had a stillness that only comes when the world outside is asleep, but inside that one-bedroom apartment, there was no peace. The air was thick with humidity, and the quiet was interrupted only by the soft, strained breathing of a child. The mother sat hunched on the floor beside the thin mattress where her son lay, sweating through his pajamas. She had placed a folded towel under his head and was holding a damp cloth to his forehead, changing it every few minutes, though she had long stopped believing it would help. His fever had started the day before, but something about the way he kept drifting in and out, his little body burning against her arm, made her feel this was different. It wasn't just a cold. It wasn't just exhaustion. This felt urgent, but she had no thermometer, no car, and no one to ask. The kitchen clock blinked 3:47 a.m. She had to be at work by 8 p.m., and she hadn't slept for even 5 minutes. Her uniform was already laid out on the edge of the couch, ironed carefully the night before. It was the only one she had. Her shoes were by the door, still damp from yesterday's rain, and her work ID was tucked into the pocket like always. She hadn't missed a single day since being hired 5 months ago. She hadn't been late once. But now her son was shivering despite the heat, mumbling words she couldn't understand, his skin red and hot to the touch. She tried to remember the last time she took him to a doctor. It had been months, maybe more. The walk-in clinic near the bus station had closed. The public clinic had no doctors after 4 p.m. Every option felt closed before she even started searching. By the time the sun began to rise, casting a weak gray light through the broken blinds, she had already made her decision. She wasn't going to leave him like that. If something happened to him while she was gone, she would never forgive herself. She gently changed his clothes, wiped him down again, and packed a small plastic bag with his birth certificate, a tattered bottle of paracetamol, and his crumpled vaccination card. Then she dressed herself in silence, put on her uniform, tied her hair back with a rubber band that snapped halfway through, and carried him outside with a blanket wrapped around his small frame. He didn't say a word. He just laid his head on her shoulders, still burning up. The bus ride to work felt like the longest 30 minutes of her life. He coughed the entire way, a dry, hoarse sound that made a few passengers stare, though no one said anything. She pressed his face into her chest to shield him from the stares, whispering softly that they would figure it out soon. When she arrived at the back entrance of the store, she walked in like she did every day, holding him close. Her manager stood at the employee counter, sipping coffee from a paper cup. He looked at her, then at the boy in her arms. His expression changed immediately. "You're late," he said. "I know," she replied quietly, out of breath. "I stayed up all night with him. He's burning up. I need to take him to the hospital." He didn't blink. "We're short-staffed today. If you leave, don't bother coming back." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for some sign of decency, some sliver of understanding. But all she saw was indifference. He wasn't angry. He wasn't concerned. He simply didn't care. Maybe he never had. Maybe no. One did. Her chest tightened as if someone had reached in and squeezed her lungs. She shifted the boy in her arms, feeling the weight of him, how limp he had become. Her eyes burned from exhaustion, but no tears came. "Then I'm leaving," she said. She turned without waiting for a response, walked back through the door, and stepped out into the morning air that was neither warm nor cold, just heavy. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know how long the hospital would take, or how much it would cost, or what they would eat the next day. But she knew one thing without question. Her son came first, always. As the doors closed behind her, she realized she had just walked away from her only source of income, her only stability, her only plan. But in that moment, with the sick weight of her child in her arms and the hollow ache of fear sitting deep in her gut, none of that mattered. What mattered was that she had walked out, not because she was strong, but because there was no other choice left. And outside, under a sky that didn't care, and a city that wouldn't pause for a woman like her, She started walking. She didn't have a destination, only a direction. The hospital was 3 bus rides away, but she didn't have the fare. Not after rent cleared out her account 2 days earlier, not after she spent the last of her coins on a box of crackers and a bottle of water for him. The nearest public clinic was closed on weekends. She had called them last month and been told, without hesitation, that emergencies must go through the central hospital. She had nodded back then, pretending she had options. Now her shoes scraped against the uneven sidewalk, soaked from last night's rain and speckled with cigarette butts. She moved one foot in front of the other while her son lay against her, barely stirring, his skin hot, his breathing shallow. She couldn't tell if he was sleeping or if something worse was setting in. She stopped outside a pharmacy, stood in the shade of the awning, and pressed his face to hers. He was still burning up. She asked the clerk inside if there was a doctor she could speak to. The woman behind the counter didn't even look up from her phone. "You need a prescription," she said flatly. "We can't give anything stronger than what you already have." She showed her the expired medicine anyway, pleading with her eyes. The clerk simply repeated the same line. She turned back toward the street and sat down on the curb, cradling her son in her lap, staring at the traffic lights. Cars passed, people passed. No one stopped. She called her mother. The phone rang 6 times, then went to voicemail. She sent a message anyway, though she already knew there wouldn't be an answer. Her mother had stopped picking up months ago, ever since the argument. She couldn't even remember what it had been about anymore. Something stupid, something old. She called a co-worker next, the one who had once offered her a ride home during a rainstorm. The call went unanswered. She left another message. "Please, it's an emergency. I just need help getting to the hospital. He's not okay." She sent it and watched the screen until it went dark again. Silence. She began walking again, past rows of shuttered shops and corner bakeries with their windows fogged up. Her arms ached. Her lower back throbbed. The sweat pooled under her shirt. At a bus stop near the edge of the neighborhood, she approached a woman sitting on a bench, holding a baby. She asked softly if the woman knew any place nearby where she could take a sick child. The woman looked at her for a second, then shook her head. "I'm not from here," she said. Then she turned her gaze back to her own baby and tightened her arms around her. The mother nodded, thanked her anyway, and walked on. At one point, she passed by the local church. The gate was locked. She rang the bell and waited. A volunteer eventually came to the door, an older woman with kind eyes but rehearsed words. "The pastor's not here today, I'm sorry. We can take your name and pray for him, though." She gave her name, unsure why. The volunteer scribbled it into a small notebook and said, "God bless you." That was it. Nothing more. The sun was now overhead, high and indifferent. Her arms were trembling. Her son hadn't spoken in over an hour. His eyes fluttered open once, briefly, but then closed again. She whispered his name, kissed his forehead, and felt panic climbing slowly up her spine like cold water. She tried to walk faster. Her legs were stiff. Her chest hurt. Every step was a negotiation between pain and purpose. She was hungry but didn't notice, thirsty but didn't stop. There was no space left for her own body. There was only him. Eventually, she reached the emergency room of the public hospital. It had taken her almost 2 hours on foot. Her arms were burning from the weight. Her clothes stuck to her skin. Her shoes felt like they'd been filled with gravel, but she had made it. The sliding doors opened in a mechanical hiss. The air inside was cold and stale, buzzing faintly with fluorescent lights and the distant coughs of other patients. She walked to the triage window and waited behind a glass wall. A nurse appeared, looked at her son, and asked her to fill out a form. She didn't have a pen. Her hands shook as she took one from the counter. When she handed the paper back, the nurse scanned it, asked a few questions, and said, "Please wait. The doctor will call you." She nodded. "How long?" The nurse didn't answer, just motioned toward the crowded row of chairs. She found a spot on the floor tucked into the corner and sank down slowly with her son still pressed to her chest. He hadn't moved. His face was flushed, lips dry, breath shallow. She rubbed his back, quietly humming a song she hadn't sung in years, not even sure if he could hear her anymore. Around her, people scrolled through their phones. Children played on the tile floor. An old man coughed violently into a tissue. No one seemed alarmed. No one looked at her twice. She was just another woman waiting, another mother in a silent war, hoping someone would see the emergency that didn't look dramatic enough to interrupt the routine. No one had opened the door when she knocked. No one had offered a ride, a phone call, a bottle of water. But she was here. Somehow, she had brought him here. And now, all she could do was wait, holding him close, whispering against his damp forehead that he was going to be okay, even though she didn't know if that was true. Hours passed. Time inside the hospital didn't move the way it did outside. It twisted, stretched, collapsed in on itself. Minutes dragged like hours, and yet somehow it all blurred together. The mother sat on the cold linoleum floor, her back pressed against a peeling wall, her son limp in her lap. No one had called their name. No one had checked on him. She watched as people came and went. Some cried, some argued, some left without being seen. But she couldn't afford to leave. She couldn't risk moving. She barely even blinked. Her arms had lost all feeling, but she didn't dare shift his weight. The last time she tried, he whimpered softly in pain, and she'd nearly broken in, half just hearing it. She lowered her head, pressing her lips against his temple. His skin was still hot, his breath shallow. She whispered again that it would be okay, that she was there, that she wouldn't leave him. She repeated it like a prayer, like a promise she had to believe, even if no one else did. It was almost evening when a nurse finally came. She knelt beside her, checked the boy's temperature with a handheld scanner, and then stood quickly. "He needs to be seen now," she said. "Follow me." The mother stood on legs that barely held her. Her knees buckled, and the nurse reached out to steady her. She shook her head and forced herself upright. Her body didn't matter. Her exhaustion didn't matter. She followed the nurse through a maze of crowded hallways until they reached a small room lit by a flickering overhead light. A doctor entered moments later, already reading the intake sheet, already speaking before fully looking up. "He's febrile, very. Has he vomited? Diarrhea? Any seizures?" "No seizures, but he's not waking up properly. He hasn't eaten. He's just out." The doctor nodded, motioned for her to lay the boy on the narrow bed. He examined him quickly, calling out orders to the nurse who scribbled them onto a chart. Blood work, IV fluids, chest X-ray, a rapid viral panel. The words flew past her like wind. She nodded even though she didn't understand most of it. All she knew was that her son was sick, really sick, and they weren't sending him home. The nurse inserted a needle into his tiny arm. He flinched, but didn't wake. The sight of it made the mother feel nauseous, like her stomach had twisted into a knot that wouldn't release. She stood in the corner, arms crossed tightly over her chest, unable to do anything except watch. 1,000 memories flashed in her mind at once. His first fever, his first steps, the first time he called her Mama. All of it felt like another life. A life where there had been time and space and hope. The doctor turned to her, finally meeting her eyes. "He's stable, but not out of danger. We're admitting him. You'll need to stay with him tonight. Is there someone you can call? Someone who can bring you clothes or food?" She shook her head. Not because there was no one, but because even if there had been, she wouldn't have asked. When the doctor left, a nurse guided her to the pediatric ward. The room was shared with another child and his father. She was given a chair, a thin blanket, and a clipboard with forms. She signed without reading. Then she sat by the bed, watching the steady drip of the IV bag and the rise and fall of his chest. He looked so small lying there, his arms at his sides, cheeks sunken from fever. She reached for his hand and held it gently, whispering that she was right there. Outside the window, the sky turned to a dusky orange. Somewhere in the city, people were eating dinner, laughing, relaxing after work. She thought of her co-workers, probably still stacking shelves and ringing up customers. She wondered if any of them had noticed she was gone, if any of them had cared. She pictured the manager's face, the way he didn't hesitate to throw away her job like it was nothing. And maybe to him it was. But to her, it had been everything. Rent, food, stability, the only thing keeping her from slipping through the cracks. She opened her phone, not to scroll or to message anyone, but just to feel less alone. A notification flashed across the screen. It was from the HR department of the store. A short message, a formal goodbye. Her employment was terminated, effective immediately. No mention of her child, no acknowledgement. Just a line at the end reminding her to return her badge. She stared at the screen until the battery died. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the hard plastic chair, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on her son. Nurses came and went. Machines beeped. The other child in the room cried for his father. But she remained still, unmoving, not because she wasn't tired. She was beyond tired, but because if she closed her eyes, even for a second, she was afraid of what might happen when she opened them again. She thought about everything she had lost, not just the job, but the sense of dignity that came with pretending things were okay. She thought about the days she skipped meals so he could eat, about the nights she cried into a towel so he wouldn't hear, about how many times she smiled at him when she was breaking inside. And now, as he lay in that hospital bed, hooked to wires and monitors, she realized the truth. There was no bottom, no rescue, no miracle waiting around the corner. There was only her hands, her body, her will. And that would have to be enough, even if it killed her. The hospital room never really got dark. Even when night took over the city, the ceiling. Light stayed dimmed, and the hallway lamps cast long shadows through the doorway. The mother sat in the same chair, one leg tucked under the other, her spine curled forward like she was holding herself together from the inside out. Her son was still asleep. His fever had broken sometime in the early morning, but his body was weak, drained. The nurses had said that was expected. The fluids were helping. The rest would come. But she didn't relax. She couldn't. There was a kind of terror that settled into the body so deeply it became part of it. She wasn't sure she'd ever be rid of it again. She stood up for the first time in hours and walked to the small sink in the corner. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. Her face looked years older. The skin around her eyes was dark, her cheeks hollowed by stress and skipped meals. Her hair had matted in the back from where she'd leaned against the wall for so long. She splashed water on her face but didn't dry it. The cold helped her stay awake. She looked down at her hands, dry, cracked, fingers trembling slightly. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten anything. Her stomach had stopped asking. When she sat back down, her phone was still dead. She had no charger, no money to buy one, no one to call, even if it turned on. The silence that surrounded her wasn't just in the room, it was in her life. A silence made of distance, abandonment, the weight of things no one ever sees. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to focus her mind on something, anything, that didn't feel like drowning. But all that came were numbers, rent, overdue bills, the balance in her bank account, 0.62, not even enough for a loaf of bread, not enough for a bus ride, not enough for hope. Later, a nurse brought in a sandwich and a juice box, setting them down on the bedside table with a quiet smile. "For you," she said gently. The mother thanked her, waited until the nurse left, then stared at the food for almost 20 minutes. She didn't want to take anything she hadn't earned, but eventually she unwrapped the sandwich and ate half of it in tiny bites, saving the rest for later. The juice she gave to her son pressing the straw gently to his lips when he stirred. A social worker stopped by in the afternoon. She was kind, wore soft colors, and spoke in a voice that was practiced, but not unkind. She asked questions about housing, support, employment. The mother answered them quietly, without embellishment, without shame. Yes, she had been working. No, she had no partner. No family nearby. Yes, she had been evicted once before. The social worker nodded slowly, taking notes, then handed her a paper with some contact numbers. Temporary shelters, food programs, assistance lines. She accepted the paper and tucked it into her bag. But she knew the list wouldn't change anything right now. Not tonight. Not tomorrow morning when she left this place with nothing but a plastic hospital bag and a child still recovering from a fever that nearly stole him away. By the time visiting hours ended and the hallway emptied, the mother was numb. Her body ached from head to toe. Her feet were swollen from walking, her back stiff from sitting, and her hands so tired they trembled even when still. She hadn't cried, not once. There hadn't been room for tears, but as night fell again and the quiet returned, something inside her cracked. She leaned forward, resting her head against her son's blanket-covered legs, and let the silence press into her. She didn't sob, she didn't make a sound, but the tears came anyway. Slow, steady, a quiet release that no one witnessed. She didn't wipe them away. There was no use pretending anymore. No face to put on, no strength to perform. She had nothing left to give, no job, no food, no certainty that anything was going to get better. All she had was this small moment of stillness in the middle of collapse. And yet, even in that moment, when the world had emptied itself of every safety, she still held on. Her hand never left his. Her body never moved from his side. Her heart, though cracked and trembling, never stopped beating in rhythm with his. That was the part no one saw, the part that never made it into reports or headlines or charity profiles, the part where a mother, completely undone, still stayed. There were no answers in that room, no miracles, no one coming to save them. But there was a kind of quiet courage there, the kind that didn't shout or shine, the kind that simply endured, without applause, without rest, without rescue, only love, raw, relentless, and invisible to everyone but the one it was meant for. Discharge came quietly, without ceremony. A nurse handed her a thin folder of papers, some instructions about medication and signs to watch for, a list of follow-up, appointments she already knew she wouldn't be able to make. She nodded, thanked them, and gathered their things, a borrowed blanket, an old stuffed animal someone had left on the shelf by the window, and the hospital bag with his spare clothes folded neatly inside. Her son held her hand as they walked through the corridor, slower now, still pale, but awake, alive. That was all that mattered. The city greeted them with noise and heat. Buses hissed, horns blared, crowds moved past like rivers that never slowed. She looked down at her son and pulled him close. His steps were light and careful, like his body remembered the sickness and hadn't yet decided to trust its own strength. She led him down the sidewalk, unsure of where to go. Home didn't feel like a place anymore, just a series of rooms they couldn't afford. The apartment was still there, but she didn't know for how long. Rent was due in 4 days. No paycheck would come. No backup plan existed, but they walked anyway. She stopped at a small corner store and checked her pockets. A crumpled 10 she hadn't remembered. Enough for bread, maybe eggs. The owner knew her, didn't ask questions. She left with a small bag and a quiet thank you. The kind of small exchange that felt heavier now. Every coin counted. Every step forward was both a victory and a gamble. They walked the last stretch back in silence. Her son rested his head against her arm, and she knew he was tired again. She was, too. When they reached the building, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of stillness and worry. Nothing had changed. The light bulb in the kitchen still flickered. The dishes were still stacked in the sink. The silence had returned like an old friend who never really left. She helped him sit on the couch, covered him with a worn blanket, and sat beside him. Her body folded inward again, tired in places she hadn't known could ache. Later, when he had fallen asleep, she sat alone in the corner of the room and pulled the hospital folder into her lap. She read the papers slowly. Fevers could return. Rest was essential. Nutrients, hydration, monitoring. Instructions meant for mothers who had choices, who could leave work for checkups, who had kitchens full of food and phones that rang when they needed help. But she memorized every word. She wouldn't let him slip again. She picked up her phone and plugged it in, using the neighbor's outlet outside the door. A small act of quiet grace the woman next door had allowed her before. When it turned on, messages appeared, none from work, none from family, but one from a woman she had once cleaned for, asking if she was still looking for work. Her hands hovered over the screen. Her back was still sore. Her arms still trembled. But she typed yes. In the following days, the rhythm returned. Not the rhythm she had known before, but a new one. Mornings began earlier. She walked to the market to ask about leftover produce. She began doing laundry for neighbors, sweeping porches, wiping windows. She accepted every job, no matter how small. She sold old clothes. She bartered. She skipped meals. But her son ate. He took his medicine. He smiled again. He laughed once, and the sound nearly undid her. At night, she stayed awake longer than she should, watching him sleep. The fever had scared something deep inside her, something primal, the kind of fear that lingers long after danger passes. She watched his chest rise and fall, his fingers curled near his face, and she made the same silent vow every night. You will not carry the weight I carried. You will not pay the price I paid. You will be free. She never told him what she had lost. Not the job, not the meals, not the days spent crying quietly in the bathroom with the faucet running to cover the sound. Those were not his burdens. They were hers to carry, like so many other invisible things. But in small ways, he would grow up knowing something about love. Not the kind that shouts or shines, but the kind that stays when everything else leaves. The kind that works without applause, that gives without question, that wakes up and tries again even when there's nothing left to give. And though the world had not saved her, though no miracle had knocked on her door, she had stayed. She had chosen him again and again and again. And sometimes that was the answer, not the return of what was lost, but the quiet proof of what had never left.